Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Dave, aka Amalila, and this video is in response to those who have asked for a Final Fantasy XI modding tutorial. In this video, I will cover the basics to help you get started and give you a few helpful hints that will hopefully save you some time. So let's jump right in. Included in this video's description is a mod creators pack I've thrown together. It includes all the tools you'll need to get started. For the most part, I'll be using Photoshop and NVIDIA's DDS Tools plugin to do most of the texture work itself. But if you don't have Photoshop, there's a lot of alternatives out there to help you on your way. Personally, I would recommend GIMP, which has a very similar workflow to Photoshop. Also available is the GIMP DDS plugin, which is linked in the description below. If you would like to follow along with this video, I would highly suggest getting these tools installed before we proceed. Also, as an FYI, when I'm working in Photoshop later in this video, I may not explain every command in detail. There are literally thousands of Photoshop tutorials available online, so if you need additional help working with the toolset, please consult with those. The first thing you'll need to do is load up Noesis, included in the Mod Creators Pack. This application, by Rich Whitehouse, is a critical tool we'll be using to identify, preview, and export content from Final Fantasy XI. Now I should take a moment to briefly mention Altana View by Tiamat for those who are interested in modding characters, NPCs, weapons, and armor. You'll notice that when using Altana View, whenever I select an option from one of these drop-down menus, it lists the location of that particular DAT file at the bottom of your screen. So for those interested in working with the aforementioned game assets, you can use Altana View to identify models and Noesis to export the textures. Back in Noesis, you'll need to navigate to your Final Fantasy XI installation directory and expand the ROM folder. Within each of these subfolders, you will find all the DATs containing Final Fantasy XI's game assets. Unfortunately, and to the best of my knowledge, there are no longer any DAT lists that accurately document what each of these folders actually contain. So you're gonna need to do some poking around to find the files you're looking for. I'm currently working on a master DAT file list, but it's nowhere near ready for release yet, so stay tuned for that sometime in the future. For the purpose of today's documentation, I'm going to choose Northern Sandoria, which is located within ROM1 32.dat. After double-clicking on the file, the zone will load up in the preview window. Holding down your left mouse button, you can rotate around the preview. Once you've positioned the camera towards the location you'd like to look at, scroll your mouse wheel up just one notch, and then another if necessary. The camera will lock itself closer to the object and allow you to look around. Using the left mouse button still allows you to look around, but now you can also hold down the right mouse button while sliding your mouse forward or backwards to move around. It's a bit odd, but it doesn't take long to catch on. If you accidentally get lost somewhere, simply double-click on the DAT file again to start over. Even though navigating around the virtual space within the DAT file isn't absolutely necessary, it can come in handy when you're trying to figure out if the DAT you're looking at is the right one. Once you're confident this is the correct DAT file, select the File menu, then Export. The first thing you need to do here is select the Browse button and choose the location you would like to save the textures and 3D model data you're about to export. I would recommend you spend a moment thinking about exactly where you want to start putting this stuff, and no, the desktop is not a good choice. Now, even though you may not necessarily need it, you're gonna need to choose an output type for the 3D model data. In nearly 100% of all cases, I found the Autodesk FBX option to be the easiest to work with. You may as well select that one every time. For additional texture output, you'll need to always select DDS image. For additional animation output, you can leave this option on default. The advanced options allow you to issue special output commands for Noesis. If you are exporting 3D data for use with software such as Maya or 3ds, you'll want to use the command in the description below. Otherwise, leave this field blank. Now that we've chosen the option we're about to work with, you can select Export at the bottom. After a few moments, the export will complete, and you can close Noesis. Looking inside the folder we just exported the files to, we can see the textures we need to get started are all here. Let's fire up Photoshop and go over some basics of Final Fantasy XI's texture formatting. Once Photoshop is loaded, go ahead and open the texture file you would like to work with. In this example, we're going to load up model SHW01C. When it asks you to choose the read properties, just stick with the defaults and click OK. The first thing I typically do is to check if this texture contains an alpha channel. It sure does. Looks like the game uses the alpha channel to cut out the leaves and flowers before it places them on whatever surface it needs to be placed. This tells us that once we have completed the primary work on the texture, we'll also need to create an updated alpha channel to go with it. The next thing we need to do is use Photoshop's rulers to separate the sections we'll be working with. If you don't see any rulers to the left or top of your workspace, press Ctrl-R to enable them. Now drag a guide out from the top ruler until it snaps to the middle of the image. Do the same thing from the left, and now we know the space we can work within. Since I know I'm going to be working on the top portion first, I'm just going to remove this vertical guide by dragging it back onto the ruler. I'm also going to resize this image to 1024 by 1024, which is the maximum allowed resolution for square textures in Final Fantasy XI. For a list of allowed texture sizes, consult Nomido's HQ texture guide linked in the description below. We're going to use that later on in this tutorial. You now have two options. You can either A, draw your own textures from scratch, B, enhance what's already there, or C, bring in a new texture and Photoshop it to fit your needs. Personally, I typically choose C for most of my work, but this is entirely up to you. Where you get your textures from is your choice, but I get most of my stuff from textures.com. In my case, I have a paid subscription to the website, but luckily they give away their lower resolution textures for free. In fact, for much of the work you'll be doing, you can easily get away with the lower resolution versions of their textures. Looking at this texture, it appears we need some kind of green pointy leaves to make this work. Searching textures.com, I was able to find this one, which looks fairly similar. Lucky for me, they had already masked out the leaves themselves, saving me a ton of time. Copy and pasting the leaf bunch into your texture, you can now start manipulating it to fit your needs. Typically, I start by renaming the layer and placing it inside a folder with an associated name. If you do this from the start, you'll save yourself some headache later on when working with complicated textures. The first thing we need to do is color correct this to better match the original texture. I'm not going to go through all of that on screen, but you'll probably want to use tools such as hue and saturation, levels or curves, and shadows/highlights. You can also use the match color option, but half the time it will just take a dump on your image. So give it a shot and see if it works in your particular situation. Now that our leaves look much closer to the originals, we can start rotating and resizing them until we get something similar to the original. In this particular case, try not to place too many leaves down as the game itself is going to layer a few of these on top of each other. Now do the same with the square on the left. You may want to drag the guide back into the center of the screen again. As for the flowers on the left, we're going to do the exact same thing until we get the desired result. One of the interesting things I noticed was that early on in development, Square didn't place similar colors around an image that contains an alpha channel. In this particular case, they simply placed a black background behind the texture. Looking at some of their textures in later expansions, they did eventually start placing like colors behind their images. The reason for this is because even though the game has an alpha channel to use as a guide for cutting out textures, sometimes some of that black background still bleeds through. By placing like colors behind your texture, this will produce a much higher quality result. I'm going to use the eyedropper tool to find a color that matches somewhere inside these flowers, then create a new background layer. Draw a box around the workspace that contains the texture you're working on, and use the paint bucket tool to paste in the background color. Now, if you really want to go the distance, you could use the paintbrush tool to paint in accurate colors all the way around the edges of your texture. This is up to you, but in this case, I think the solid colors should work just fine. Now the same thing with the bushes, and we're done with the primary texture. You may want to put some finishing touches on your texture, such as grunge, shadowing, and miscellaneous touch-ups, but that's up to you. So now we're going to move on to the alpha channel. Remember how I told you to organize your layers early on? Here's one reason why. Go ahead and make a copy of each of these folders by drag and dropping them onto the New Layer button at the bottom of your Layers window. Now right-click on the copied folders and select Merge Group. You can also go ahead and turn off the original folders. We don't want those doubling up the edges. Above your Layers panel, select the Channels tab and click on Alpha 1 at the bottom. In your Tools panel on the left, make sure you have white as the foreground and black as the background. Anything in between will be transparent. White is solid, and black is transparent. Now hit Ctrl-A to select everything, and then simply hit Delete on your keyboard. Now we have a blank canvas to work with as our alpha channel. In some cases, you may want to copy and paste the original alpha channel into your primary Layers panel as a backup, but in this case, I think we're just fine. Select RBG from the list here and go back to the primary Layers panel. Now select the merged group you would like to use for the alpha channel. In this case, I'm going to select the flowers, then Control-click on the thumbnail in the Layers panel. This will automatically select the edges of the flowers. Now simply navigate back to your alpha channel and use the Paint Bucket tool to paste a solid white color inside of the dotted outlines. Now rinse and repeat for the long bush at the top and the square bush on the left. Select RBG from the list and then navigate back to your primary Layers panel. This texture is ready to go. Select File, Save As. In the Save As type options, select D3D/DDS and give your texture a name. I would recommend you keep the original file name and place your updated textures within a separate folder. This will make things easier to work with later on. Once you're done, hit Save. What comes up next are a number of options to choose from when saving DDS textures. For Final Fantasy XI, we're going to select DXT3 Explicit Alpha. Be sure Generate MIP Maps is selected, and then save. Now that we've completed our texture, we need to use Change Text to help us modify the DAT file and eventually place the new texture into the game. Stopping briefly for a tip, I would highly recommend you make consistent backup copies of the DAT files you're working with. If Final Fantasy XI performs an update, they will be deleted. If you're using a Shida and have placed these DAT files inside the DATs folder, you should still make backup copies. Back to Change Text, there are only 3 buttons you need to know. The dots in the upper right allow you to select the DAT file you'll be working with. After that, the button on the left allows you to import your new texture, while the button on the right allows you to export textures from the selected DAT file. Personally, I've never used the export button, since there's no way to export all textures at once. From here, you would have to do them one by one. Using the dotted button in the upper right, I'm going to select the 32.dat file we exported from earlier. Remember, this is found within the ROM1 folders. Scroll down until you find model SHW01C. Looking at the other columns, we can see that this is a DXT3 texture. The dimensions are 128 by 128, the hex address, and data size. Now this is where Nomido's guide is going to come in handy. Go ahead and load this up from the video description below, or use the version bundled with this tutorial pack, just in case the site ever goes down. On the left side of this work of art, click on the HQ Texture Guide and scroll a little over halfway down. We're looking for this chart right here. This guide will be a handy reference when we're hex editing the DAT file. Now go ahead and navigate to the folder that contains the DAT file you're working on. Right-click and then select Hex Edit with Hex Workshop. If you get an error when you select this, just try again. In Hex Workshop, hit Ctrl-G to bring up the Go-To command. Be sure Hex is selected, and then type in the hex address displayed within Change Text. Click Go. Now select the Edit menu, then click on Select Block. Be sure Decimal and Size of Block are selected, then type in the DAT size and click OK. Now hit Delete on your keyboard and select Yes when prompted if you're sure. Next, hit Ctrl-G again, and then go to be sure we're back where we started. Now, hit Ctrl-Insert on your keyboard, or Edit Insert from the menu to bring up the Insert Bytes command. Be sure Decimal is selected, and the fill box at the bottom contains 2 Fs. Using Nomido's guide, go ahead and copy the appropriate data size. Be sure there's no extra spaces here. Paste this into the number of bytes field in the Hex Workshop and click OK. Now hit Ctrl-G to go to your original position. Just to the left of the red Fs is where we're going to start our work. Now, Change Text tells us the original dimensions were 128 by 128. So by using Nomido's chart as a reference, we can expect to see the following address block. Looking at Hex Workshop, we can see it right here. So what we need to do is replace that address block with the version for 1024 by 1024 textures. Starting with the file size amount, you'll notice that there are only 2 sets of zeros separating the tens in the new address block, while the old one has 3 sets of zeros. So what we're going to do is click on the 40, then type in 0010. Next, we'll replace the 02 with 10 without adding any extra zeros this time. Now, this matches the Nomido guide. Moving on to the dimensions, the original numbers for a 128 by 128 texture is 8080. Looking at the examples in Nomido's guide, we can see we're going to need to replace those 80s with 00, 04, then the same for the other one. Lastly, we need to update the mystery number. No one truly knows what this number does exactly, but it needs to be updated or you're gonna have a bad time. The original is 0302. So looking at Hex Workshop, here it is. This will get replaced with 0380. Go ahead and select File, Save. If you're prompted to make a backup copy, definitely do so. You can now close Hex Workshop. The DAT file is modified and ready to import the new texture. Back in Change Text, let's go ahead and reload the DAT file by using the dots in the upper right corner. Scrolling down again to model SHW01C, you can now see the changes have taken effect. If you see anything weird here, you'll need to go back into Hex Workshop to correct it, or simply start over again. Hex editing could be a daunting and frustrating experience at first, but don't worry, you'll get the hang of it. From the list, select Model SHW01C and then click the Import button. Select your new texture and click Open. Congratulations, you have now completed your very first mod for Final Fantasy XI. Loading up the game now shows us the new texture in all its detailed glory. Thanks for joining me today, and if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments below. Be sure to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe.